In the history of ancient Rome, power was often laced with cruelty. Yet, even among the emperors, one man achieved a darkness so absolute it transcended personal vice and became official state policy. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, known to the world as Caligula. The corridors of his imperial palace did not merely house the machinery of governance. They became the architecture of terror. Under Caligula, the Roman elite learned a new, terrifying reality, that degradation could be calculated, registered, and executed with the chilling precision of a census. This was not random insanity but intentional structure. Cruelty was codified, listed in official ledgers as routinely as any mundane expense of the empire. Every act of violation had a price tag, an entry number, and a procedure, transforming the greatest empire of the ancient world into a machine of organized depravity. To understand this collapse, we must rewind to the moment a smiling young man was hailed as Rome's great hope. Caligula, the adored son of a legendary general, was welcomed to the throne in 37 CE with 100 days of public celebration. Senators, tired of the suffocating paranoia of his predecessor Tiberius, finally relaxed. The people saw a charismatic, educated, and charming young ruler. No one imagined this golden boy would soon become the architect of Rome's most profound moral corruption. His early life was a strange blend of privilege and trauma. He survived the suspicion and political purges that destroyed his family, learning a critical lesson in Tiberius's court. Survival depended entirely on the art of deception. He mastered the role of harmless, foolish, and non-threatening. When he first took power, the promises of a golden age seemed real. He cut taxes, released prisoners, and showered the legions with gifts. Rome adored him, scattering flowers in his path and singing songs praising his generosity. The transformation from the fear-driven isolation of Tiberius to Caligula's open, generous rule was astonishing. He appeared approachable, almost divine in his sudden popularity. The people sincerely believed the gods had finally granted them the ideal ruler. Then, in the autumn of 37 CE, everything changed. A mysterious violent illness struck the emperor down. He spent weeks on the brink of death, afflicted by fevers and convulsions so violent it required multiple men to hold him still. Court doctors documented his delirious episodes, where he claimed direct communion with Jupiter himself. Rome was paralyzed with fear. Citizens vowed their own lives if it meant saving the emperor. When Caligula finally recovered, something fundamental had shifted. The first sign was subtle, yet ominous. He commanded that the heads of every god statue in Rome be replaced with his own likeness, merging his identity with the divine. The psychological shift became impossible to ignore. His eyes, once lively, turned hollow and predatory, the pupils unnaturally wide. He suffered relentless insomnia, wandering the palace at night, whispering to statues and speaking to the moon. Servants sometimes found him at dawn, alone and covered in soil, claiming he had been planting the seeds of Rome's destiny. But what he planted was not a future. It was the chilling foundation for his descent into organized terror. His fixation first manifested within his own household, with his three sisters, Drusilla, Julia Livilla, and Agrippina the Younger. They were no longer merely family. They became the initial victims, the subjects of what would soon turn into state policy. His obsession with Drusilla was particularly extreme. He treated her as his imperial consort, seating her in places reserved only for empresses. When she died in 38 CE, Caligula spiraled into a frantic rage, forbidding all laughter, bathing, and family meals. His grief was not love, but the fury of someone who felt his personal property had been stolen by death itself. With Drusilla gone, his attention shifted, moving inexorably outward to the daughters and wives of Rome's most powerful families. This is the moment the system truly began its grim operation. Caligula forced noblewomen to participate in degrading rituals, often in the presence of their husbands and fathers. While he observed from a crafted golden throne, he took meticulous notes: who appeared eager, who hesitated, who merely tried to be polite. These observations were later used as potent political leverage, transforming private humiliation into public power. A senator who showed reluctance in front of the throne soon found his young son returned to him mutilated, a visceral warning that neutrality did not exist in Caligula's Rome. everyone would be made complicit. Hidden writings from the era, such as those by the physician Lucius Scriba, detail how Caligula forced doctors to examine noblewomen, assessing their fertility and their ability to endure repeated use. Humiliations performed directly in front of the emperor. This was not spontaneous depravity, it was bureaucratic, executed with the cold precision of a military exercise. Rates and fees for these enforced services were standardized, transforming personal violation into a predictable source of state revenue. The payments did not disappear into private pockets. They flowed straight into the imperial treasury, recorded as voluntary contributions for the good of the state. Caligula had successfully transformed the destruction of dignity into a government structure. The palace itself was refitted, rebranded, and dedicated as a temple of divine service. Halls that had once echoed with debates about law and war were now staged chambers. The room of Jupiter, the chamber of Venus, each reserved for ritualized abuses, with the emperor playing the role of a living god. The senators who had built Rome were made to walk those same corridors, hearing the sounds and seeing the signs of the nightly horrors, utterly compelled to remain silent. The sheer intricacy of the system guaranteed complicity. Noble wives were drafted into what the emperor called the imperial cult, following schedules and wearing designated sheer uniforms. Next came the daughters, some as young as 12, initiated under the pretense of sacred instruction. Yet Caligula's ambition went beyond simple humiliation. Secret memos describe a program of selective breeding. Women judged most fertile were compelled to bear children destined to be raised as imperial dependents, separated from their true fathers. Every conception, every birth, and every infant death was meticulously logged in the imperial ledgers. Even men were not exempt, with sons of patrician houses often forced into feminized roles, paraded at banquets, and auctioned for the night. Each public violation was a deliberate political statement. Nothing is sacred that I cannot defile. No tradition is safe. No family is immune from collapse. He enlisted families as torchbearers in their own ruin, forcing them to sign contracts consenting to the service of their wives and daughters. The Senate was pressured to pass laws that cloaked the abuse in religious legitimacy. One statute declared the emperor's body sacred, framing any union with him as a form of worship. Caligula had built legal architecture to sanctify his violations. He did not only attack families from the outside, he turned them into instruments of their own destruction through coercive complicity. The story of Senator Cornelius stands as a grim example of this tactic. When Cornelius publicly refused to hand over his wife, the defiance was brave but fatal. The next morning, his 8-year-old son was discovered on the Senate steps, mutilated and bearing a message carved into his flesh. The warning worked instantly. That afternoon, Cornelius delivered his wife. Months later, when she conceived by imperial decree, the senator was forced by law to recognize the child as a legitimate heir, abandoning his other offspring. Humiliation was made law. Running this apparatus required an administration that rivaled Rome's civil government. Hidden clerks kept meticulous registers in a sealed archive beneath the Palatine, detailing the victim's name, rank, description, acts performed, and fees paid. The dispersion of responsibility made it easier for hundreds of people, scribes, guards, accountants, and official midwives to avoid moral ownership. No one stood alone as the monster. Everyone could claim they were merely fulfilling a role. The full moons brought the darkest spectacles. Caligula staged lunar fertility rites in a converted amphitheater, turning it into a staged pagan temple, where husbands in senatorial togas were forced to maintain composure while their wives were degraded below. The emperor orchestrated every detail like a ringmaster, using a gilded baton to indicate his choices. Scribes documented everything, turning human suffering into pageantry and then into a commodity. An entire shadow economy grew up around the palace's needs. Clandestine apothecaries supplied desperate remedies, tutors taught young survivors how to mimic compliance, and doctors opened practices focused on repair. Everyone who touched the system charged a fee. Everyone profited. The horror was not simply that Caligula committed atrocities, but that he engineered a society where atrocity paid. Greed, fear, Fear, ambition, and vanity became incentives to obey and to participate. All of Rome became entangled in the crime. The true narrative was not in the censored histories but in the bodies of the victims. Scars formed like a private alphabet of pain. Faces stopped smiling. The facial muscles of joy atrophied from disuse. There was Valeria, the daughter of a senator, who fell completely silent after months of ongoing abuse. Doctors confirmed her vocal cords were sound, yet she had lost the language to describe what she endured. Her silence was a contagious dread. Caligula's doctrine was twisted. By destroying motherly love, childhood innocence, and paternal honor, he believed he was unmaking the moral foundations of the Republic. Resistance was nearly impossible. Those who attempted suicide were often revived by skilled imperial physicians and returned to the spectacle, often punished with extra public humiliation to deter others. There was, in short, no true escape. The emperor sometimes showcased the ledger itself as an instrument of terror. He would read clinical selections aloud in the Senate, forcing fathers and husbands to hear the clinical descriptions of what had been done to their families. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's elite protectors, were embedded in the system, often rewarded with victims after imperial use. They were complicit administrators guarding the corridors of the horror machine. One such man was Cassius Chaerea, a veteran whom Caligula relentlessly mocked and humiliated. The taunts, initially petty, piled up until something in Chaerea snapped, not compassion, but fury at his own debasement. On the night of January 24, 41 CE, after a final brutal spectacle, Caligula moved through an underground passage. Chaerea and a group of conspirators ambushed him, stabbing him repeatedly, dozens of wounds, ending the man who stood at the center of the darkness. The irony was bitter. The same men who had helped enable the system were the ones who ended the man at its head. Caligula's wife and young daughter were murdered shortly after, as the conspirators intended to wipe out the dynasty entirely. The new emperor, Claudius, immediately declared a damnatio memoriae. Statues were toppled, inscriptions chiseled away, and official memory was censored. But the records, the pregnancies, the scars, and the memory of the systemic horror could not be erased by blades. The children born under the breeding program grew up without knowing their origins. Victims aged with secrets sealed inside them. Fathers who had once held torches in state ceremonies could never look their daughters in the eye again. Caligula's death removed a man, not the system he had engineered. Institutions of cruelty have long afterlives. The registers, the powers, and the legal precedents did not vanish with his corpse. They could be rewritten, reissued, and adapted. Without protective families, without laws to shield the vulnerable, new generations learned that certain evils survive beyond their architects, passing from one set of administrators to another like a contagious legacy. In the end, the most damning testament was the speed of Rome's outward recovery. Men applauded an act of murder with the same hands that had once held torches for the rituals. The empire moved on, but inwardly the wounds remained. The children marked by the program and the families shattered by complicity became part of a long, dark inheritance. Caligula had not simply indulged depravity. He had written the instructions for turning atrocity into governance, and manuals for institutionalized cruelty once written are never truly gone.